Good morning, you guys. It's a beautiful morning and I'm heading out into my garden to harvest some broccoli. The broccoli, I checked the heads and some of them are getting really close to being too late to harvest. So I want to go ahead and get this harvest in. And also, let me tell you guys, this is the first crop where I feel like I've had a full harvest of broccoli in the spring. In the fall, it's so much easier for me, but the spring has been a little bit more tricky in my climate in Arkansas where we get hot really fast. So I wanted to share with you some things I did differently this year that I think really did contribute to this excellent broccoli harvest this spring. Such a beautiful morning today. This is my straw bale garden and I've got some broccoli planted here past the cabbage. And this was kind of just where I planted this because I had some extra. And I'll come back to these in a minute. Yeah, I think that one is definitely needing to be harvested today. We'll come back to these. But first I want to show you the primary planting, which is actually on the other side of this cover crop. You remember me planting this last fall? Check out that video. This cover crop is growing strong. Okay, so this is the main broccoli crop I have going right here. Let's take a look at this head here. This is a Castle Dome broccoli. And if you look very carefully here, you can see that in the center here, these are starting to separate. The florets are starting to separate a little bit. You can see the varying colors between the light green and the dark green. What's going to happen is if this continues to grow on the plant, each of these little florets are going to separate and eventually they will produce flowers and seeds, and all of that is the normal function and growth pattern of the broccoli. But we want to eat the broccoli, so we need to get it cut before this happens. And you can see here, like I said, this is starting to separate a little bit, which means we really need to get this harvested. Now, let's compare it to one that has not yet shown signs of separation so you can see the difference. This one right here is Green Magic, and it is a little bit behind the Castle Dome. You can still see a little bit of the differences in colors here, but for the most part, the florets are still fairly tight. I could give this a little bit more time, but I still need to watch it very carefully because this could be harvested now if I wanted to, but I could probably give it a couple more days. I just need to watch it a lot more carefully. You can just see that it's going to be a little bit tighter than the Castle Dome I just showed you. Now, I want to show you one that is definitely starting to begin the process of bolting flowering, and this one's one we got to get harvested right away. Moving over here, this is a Monty variety. This one is beside my straw bales, but the Monty I have in the other bed is also doing the same thing. And you can just see compared to the other ones that you can tell these florets are starting to separate where you've got these little clusters of circles surrounding that. This is going to continue to separate, and what you'll find too is even if I harvest it now or a few days later, these are going to be a little bit gritty to the taste. Not too bad. I don't think that I've missed the window on this one yet, but I definitely need to harvest it today because the more that these start to separate, the more that they will decline in eating quality. Now that you can see the difference, let's go ahead and get this broccoli harvested. I got all of the broccoli harvested that I decided to harvest today. I did leave a few still that I'm gonna give a few more days that I think they'll be fine. I don't plan on preserving the broccoli, even though I've done that in the past. I would freeze them and they did great, but I think I wanna save that for my fall harvest and hopefully just eat this fresh. So I'm gonna be working on eating through this with our family and then maybe in a week or so, finish the rest of the harvest. As I said, this has been the best spring broccoli harvest that I've ever had. Heads this size are not that uncommon for me in the fall. It's so much easier for me to grow broccoli in the fall where I live, just because it gets so hot so fast, and it's so easy for these broccoli to just turn to flowers so quickly before you even notice it. And then at that point, the heads aren't even useful. I mean, you could still eat them, but if you're growing for the head, this is really what you want to harvest. So how did I get this kind of broccoli this spring when I have failed at it so many other years? In fact, for several years there, I just completely stopped growing broccoli in the spring because I got so frustrated with it. Last year, I decided to try it again with some new varieties that gave me hope. And this year, I think that with a little bit of help with the weather and some strategic planning on my part, that's what really made the difference this year. So here are the 3 things that I think made a bigger difference in my spring broccoli harvest this year. Number 1, I started these seeds way early. I started the seeds indoors on January 16th, and just to give you some context here, our average last frost date is right around early April, so that is quite a bit of time before our average last frost date. I sowed them on January 16th. I potted them up indoors on February the 12th. And as soon as I could, I actually got them into the greenhouse. So they spent most of their time after they were potted up and even as young seedlings in the greenhouse. I think having that exposure to the sunlight initially made a difference as well. And then I was able to plant them in the garden at the end of February. February 27th, in fact. Normally I wouldn't plant them out till about 4 weeks before our average last frost date in early March, but at the time we were having some mild temperatures and not a whole lot of freezing weather, so I took advantage of that and I got those transplants in the garden at the end of February. Now we still had freezing temperatures after that, don't get me wrong. We actually got down to 20 degrees at the end of March. I covered my crops with a floating row cover. Actually, the main crop I covered, the ones by the straw bales I didn't cover at all, and that one night of 20 degrees didn't bother them. Now I think a lot of 20-degree nights probably would have, but that one little cold snap didn't seem to bother them at all. So I do say that the weather did play a role because we didn't have anything major that was against them once they got into the garden except for that one cold night. When I look at how long it took from transplant to harvest, transplanted it on February 27th. I'm harvesting these on April 28th, so that's 2 months after I transplanted these particular varieties. Which brings me to the number 2 reason that I think that this was so successful this year, and that was I grew heat-tolerant varieties, specifically varieties that have proven well to do well in my climate. I think that's a great rule of thumb anywhere, but especially with a crop that may be a little bit tougher for you to grow in your climate. For us, it's cool season crops. For you, it might be hot season crops. But to try to find a variety that actually works better in your climate, that's made a huge difference for me. If you notice the 3 varieties that I grew, they were Castle Dome, which is what this is, Green Magic, and Monty. Monty was a new one for me. I bought it because it said it had excellent heat tolerance. The Monty was actually the first one that's kind of started to separate a little bit when I compared all of these. The Castle Dome developed the biggest head and developed quicker than the other ones, and then the Green Magic was just barely behind it. So I would say the 2 stars of this show were the Castle Dome and the Green Magic, which by the way, also work fantastic in my fall garden. But choosing the right varieties, the ones that are more heat tolerant, I think allowed these to continue to grow in my garden without bolting too early. And the number 3 thing that I do think made the difference, especially when I compare this season to last season, is that both of these places where the broccoli grew were in good soil and full sun. I say full sun, the ones by the straw bales got a little bit of morning shade, but for the most part, both plants did get full sun. And while you may not think that that's a good thing for a cool season crop like broccoli, it actually is in the early spring when the days aren't as long and when the temperatures aren't as high. I do think the full sun made a big difference. And like I said, the soil. This soil was topped off with compost before we planted, which is always a good idea. The soil by the straw bales, actually I didn't amend it at all, but I think they benefited from the nitrogen that I was adding to the straw bales as I was conditioning the straw bales, because I think some of that just ran through the bale, and I think the broccoli was enjoying a lot of that nitrogen from the straw bale garden. So that's a good companion combination that I discovered by accident that I may need to replicate in the future. And as I said, I do think weather did play a role. The fact that I was able to get these in the garden in late February and have them start to flourish before we started to have any other cooler temperatures. And also we didn't have any majorly hot temperatures in March and April, which can sometimes happen in Arkansas. And when that does, that can definitely throw a broccoli plant, especially into bolting, because they don't like the high heat. They don't like heat in the air, they don't like the soil warming up, and so you really have to watch if you have any hot spells. Mulch is your friend to try to keep the soil as cool as possible during the early part of the spring to hopefully get these to be able to form heads before they start to flower. Bottom line is, if you've had issues growing broccoli in the past, especially if you live in a climate similar to mine, most likely the biggest mistake I see beginning gardeners make is that they plant too late. So even though it may be too late for you this spring, I totally recommend you planting a fall crop. That was much easier for me. Just for context, I start those seeds in July, and then I usually plant them out in my garden in the later part of August and early September. Our average last frost date is not into early November, so keep that in mind. But fall crops of broccoli I found are so much easier than the spring crops. But if you do want a spring crop for next season, just keep in mind that planting earlier than you think, can make a difference. It certainly did for my crop. For more tips on growing broccoli for beginners, check out this video that I did last year where I talk more about fall planting of broccoli. And also, if you're a podcast listener, especially as you're working out in the garden, you might be interested in this podcast episode where I talk about what can go wrong with growing broccoli. Broccoli is definitely not the easiest plant that I have grown, but once I started having some success with it and started eating it fresh from my garden, I would never go back. Broccoli is so good homegrown, you would be surprised. Well, thank you so much for joining me in my garden today. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Subscribe for future videos as we go along in the garden season, and I will see you again next Wednesday.